Good day, everyone. My name is Olakole Arije. We are going to have the part 2 and the concluding part of the nervous system. The part 1 can be accessed by subscribing to my YouTube channel or just type in Olakole Arije on YouTube to have access to my YouTube channel. We are starting with how impulses are transmitted along the neuron. Impulses or electrical impulses are a wave of electrical activity that travels along the neuron, wherein the neuron must generate electricity. For the neurons to generate electricity, impulses in the form of waves must travel along it, and in that process, an impulse is generated in the form of electricity, either to the CNS or away from the CNS. So another one is the resting neuron. The resting neuron. What are resting neurons? A resting neuron is one that do not or is not transmitting electrical impulses. So a neuron that is not transmitting electrical impulse is said to be resting. But such a neuron have the ability to generate electricity. So a resting neuron can generate electricity by being polarized. So for a resting neuron to be polarized, sodium ion is pumped out of the cell. Sodium ion is pumped out of the cell, while potassium ion is pumped into the cell. And in this way, the entire cell become polarized. In this way, the entire cell become polarized. Stimulation of a neuron. In response to a stimuli, the cell body receives electrical impulses from the dendron. And when this impulse received by the cell body from the dendron is large enough to overcome the membrane resistance, then the cell body transmits the impulse to the axon. But when the cell body receives impulses from the dendron that are not large enough to overcome the membrane resistance, then the impulse dies in the cell body. So a stimulated neuron acts in a all or none manner. In a all, that is, when the impulse received by the cell body is so large from the dendron that it can overcome the membrane resistance, the impulses generated in this manner travels along the axon in a whole manner. But when the impulse is so small that it cannot travel, it's so small that it cannot overcome the membrane resistance, then such an impulse dies in the cell membrane in a non manner. So a stimulated neuron acts in a whole or non manner. The intensity of the impulse produced is the same, irrespective of how strong the stimuli is. Transmission of impulse across the synapse. Transmission of impulse across the synapse. Impulses are transmitted across the synapse in a chemical form from the end of a neuron to the beginning of another neuron is a gap called a synaptic gap where impulses have to pass through. So there are neurochemicals within the gap. These neurochemicals helps to transmit the electrical impulse from one cell or neuron to the other neuron. An example of such neurochemical is acetylcholine. It's a neurochemical found at the junction of the synaptic gap. So the knob between the two neurons have to exchange chemicals, and the function of the acetylcholine or the neurotransmitter is to be able to move the neuron, is to be able to move the impulse to the next neuron, and then converting it again into electrical impulses, which then travels along the axon. So the next is action and behavior. The next is action and behaviors. Actions are responses to stimuli. There are two groups of actions. One is voluntary action. The second is involuntary action. The first is voluntary actions, the second is involuntary actions. Voluntary actions are actions that must be thought first before they are performed. They are actions that are controlled by the higher centers of the brain. The actions that are controlled by the higher centers of the brain, the reflex arc, as well as the fibers of the spinal cord. Examples include seeing a book on the floor and picking it up, and so on and so forth. The involuntary actions are actions that are not thought of. Involuntary actions are actions that produce automatic response to a stimulus. They are actions that are not thought. They are actions that are not thought of. They are actions that are protective in nature. Involuntary actions are actions that are protective. They are also called reflex actions. They are reflex actions. Examples include knee jerk. Examples include holding a hot object and dropping it. There are differences between voluntary actions and involuntary actions. Or reflex actions. Involuntary actions are also referred to as reflex actions. So the differences between them are as follows. For voluntary actions, it requires the higher center of the brain. Voluntary actions are actions that require the higher centers of the brain. Involuntary actions are actions that require the spinal cord as well as the hindbrain. Voluntary actions are controlled by the higher centers of the brain. Involuntary actions are controlled by the spinal cord and the hindbrain. Numerous neurons are involved in involuntary actions. Few neurons are involved in involuntary actions. In voluntary actions, the impulses are not very fast. Involuntary actions, impulses generated are very fast. In voluntary action, the stimulus varies with circumstances. In involuntary actions, the stimulus is stereotyped. The reflex arc is the pathway taken by an electrical impulse in response to a stimulus. The parts of a reflex arc are one, we have the sensory receptor, we have the sensory receptors, we have the sensory neuron, we have the relay neuron, we have the motor neuron, then we have the effectors. Effectors, which are usually the muscles, and then glands. So these are the pathway, or the parts of the reflex arc. The sensory receptors are the receptors that dictate stimuli from the environment. They are usually scattered in the sense organs. The sensory neurons are the neurons that transmit the impulses detected by the sensory receptors to the CNS for interpretation. The relay neuron are those that relay or transmit the interpreted impulses from the CNS to the motor neurons, while the motor neurons are those that transmit the impulses from the CNS to the effectors. While the effectors take action, they could be the muscles as well as the glands. The glands produce hormones in response to the stimulus, while the muscles can be contracted or relaxed. So the muscle can be made to contract or relax in response to the stimulus, while the glands can be made to be secreted or inhibited also in response to the stimulus. The next one is behaviors. Behaviors could be learned or instinct. Learned behavior is called conditional reflex. Learned behavior is a conditional reflex. So it has to be learned before the action is exhibited. And once it has been learned, it becomes a part of the individual. So after that, the individual will not have to, or the organism will not have to think about it before it is performed. Instincts are inborn. Instincts are inborn. They are natural reflexes. The reflexes that occur without any thought. So learned or conditional reflex was experimented by a scientist called Ivan Pavlov. He used a dog to experiment how conditional reflex occur when the dog salivates in the presence or absence of a food by responding to a bell. An instinct, like I said earlier, is an inborn or is a natural reflex activity. For example, the suckling of the tongue of a baby when it is placed in his mouth. So when the tongue or the finger is placed in the mouth of a child, it automatically sucks it. An earthworm would naturally run away or move away from light and other impulses another responses that are instinct, or a learned or a conditional reflex are activities that have to be learned, and after it has been mastered, the organism will now have to think about it before such action is executed again. An example of such action is walking, learning to ride a car, learning to drive a car, learning to ride a bicycle, and so on and so forth. The next is the differences between reflex action and conditional reflex. Reflex action and conditional reflex. Differences between reflex action and conditional reflex. A reflex action takes a short time to occur. A conditional reflex takes a longer time to occur. The reflex action is controlled by the spinal cord and relayed to the hindbrain, while conditional reflex is controlled by the brain. Reflex action is an inborn behavior. Conditional reflex is a learned behavior. Actions of the reflex start in the muscles. The actions of the conditional reflex starts in the brain.